Hello there, I'm your imaginary friend, and today I'd like to read to you another work by Walter de la Mare. This is called A Recluse. Now, as always, try to bear in mind that sometimes an author will include things in their work that at the time of writing seemed fine to them, but it's not always fine. A Recluse by Walter de la Mare. Which of the world's wiseacres, I wonder, was responsible for the aphorism that the best things in life are to be found at its edges? It's too vague, of course. So much depends on what you mean by the best and the edges. And in any case, most of us prefer the central. It has been explored. It is safe. You know where you are. It has been amply, copiously corroborated. But amusing? Well, hardly. Quite so. As my friend Mr. Bloom would have said. But then Mr. Bloom has now ventured beyond the utmost borderline. He has passed over. He is, I imagine, interested in edges no longer. I've been reminded of him again, as if there were any need of it, by an announcement in the Times. His mansion, Montresor, is for sale by auction. The auctioneers are enthusiastic. This singularly charming freehold residential property, in all about 38 acres, the matured pleasure grounds of unusual beauty. I don't deny it. But was it discreet of them to describe the house itself as an imposing mansion? A pair of slippers in my possession prompts this query. But how answer it? I can only make my record as full, concise, and definite as possible. It was an afternoon towards the end of May, a Thursday. I had been to see a friend who, after a dangerous illness, was now apparently convalescent. We sat talking a while. He propped up on his pillow, his eyes fixed on the green branches beyond his window, and that bleak, hungry look on his face one knows so well. It was pathetic to watch his greedy admiration of the flowers I had brought him, though he could scarcely more than whisper his pleasure. We discussed the weather, a new novel or two. He told me of his plans, in the most matter-of-fact fashion. But when we fell silent, and the nurse covertly looked in, I rose with an almost indecent readiness, clasped his cold, bony hand in mine, and bade him good-bye. It is always a relief to leave a sick room, to breathe freely again after that drugged and stagnant atmosphere. The medicine bottles, the stuffiness, the dulcet optimism. Dismal reminders. I confess I found myself softly whistling as I climbed back into my cozy two-seater again. A lime tree bower her garage was, the flickering leafy evening sunshine gilding the dust on her bonnet. I released the brake. She leapt to life again. And what wonder? Flora and her nymphs might at any moment turn the corner of this sequestered country road. I felt adventurous. It would be miserably unenterprising to go back by the way I'd come. I should find my way home. Early evening is, with dawn, day's most seductive hour. And how entrancing is any scene on earth after even a fleeting glance into the Valley of Shadows. The woods and meadows were almost absurdly gay in their new green coats and garlands. The looping wild-flowered lanes, the buttercup hollows, the parsley nooks and dusky coppices, the amorous birds and butterflies. Nothing lovely can long endure. The sweet and sickly blossom of the hawthorns hinted at that. Drowsy, lush, tepid, inexhaustible. An English evening. And as I bowled idly on, I overtook a horseman. So far as I can see, he has nothing whatever to do with what comes after, no more at most than my poor thin-nosed, gasping friend. I put him in because he put himself in, and in an odd way, too, for at first sight and at a distance, I mistook the creature for a bird. A large, strange, ungainly bird. It was the cardboard box he was carrying accounted for that. Many shades lighter than his clothes and his horse, it lay on his back, corner-wise, suspended about his neck with a piece of rope. As he trotted along, he bumped in the saddle, and his box bumped too. Meanwhile, odd mechanical creature, he beat time to his bumping on his animal's shoulder blade with a little leafy switch he carried. I glanced up into his face as I passed him, a grayish, hairy, indefinite face, like a miller's. To mistake a cardboard box for a bird, he amused me. I burst out laughing, never dreaming but that he was gone forever. 5 or 6 miles farther on, after passing a huddle of derelict Tudor cottages and a duck pond, I caught my first glimpse of the house of Montresor, and I defy anybody with eyes in his head to pass that house unheeded. And as I sat looking at it through its wrought iron gates, I heard presently the beating of a horse's hoofs in the dust. Even before I glanced over my shoulder, I knew what I should see, my man on horseback. He had taken the high road, I the low. There rode a miller on a horse, a Jake on a donkey could do no worse, with a hey and a hey, holly-ho. Meal on his chops and his whiskers, too. The devil sowed tares where the tare crop grew, with a hey and a hey, holly-ho. Up he bumped, down he bumped, with his leafy switch kept time. When he drew level, I twisted my head round and yelled up at him a question about the house. The curmudgeon never so much as paused. He merely pushed that indiscriminately hairy face a half-foot or so towards me, and flung up his hand with the switch. Maybe the poor fellow was dumb. His raw-boned horse had coughed as if in sympathy, but anyhow his gesture seemed clearly to intimate, though with unnecessary violence, that Montresor wasn't worth asking questions about, and that I had better move on. And naturally it intensified my interest. I watched him out of sight. Why I have mentioned him, I scarcely know, except that there he was, for an instant, at those gates, and as soon as he was gone, I turned to enjoy another look at the house, a prolonged look, too. To all appearance, it was vacant, but if so, it could not have been vacant long. The drive was sadly in need of weeding. It was green with moss, but the lawns had been recently mown. High-grown forest trees towered round about it, overtopping its roof, chiefly chestnuts, their curved lower branches drooping so close to the turf that they almost brushed its surface. They were festooned from crown to root with branching candelabra-like spikes of blossoms. Imagine them on a still pitch-black night, their every cup of blossom upholding a tiny phosphoric taper. Not that Montresor, or rather the 2/3 of its facade within sight, was a particularly old or beautiful house. It looked to have been built about 1750, and, like the characteristic work of that period, from furniture to verse, was of pleasant proportions. But it had atmosphere. It wore a look of reticence rather than of mystery. It seemed to be holding back from the interloper's scrutiny, to be positively taking advantage of the cover afforded by those widespread blossoming branches. I could, and I would, it whispered, as do certain human faces, though no doubt the queer gesture and the queerer looks of my cardboard-boxed gentleman on horseback accounted for something of its effects. A thin haze of cloud had spread over the sky, paling its blue. The sun had set, and a diffused light hung over its walls and roof. It suited the house, as powder may suit a pale face. Even nature appeared to be condoning these artifices, those hollowish lawns, the honeyed azaleas, those stagnant chestnuts. How absurd are one's little hesitations! All this while I'd been debating whether to approach nearer on foot or to drive boldly in. I think I chose the second alternative, with the faint notion in my mind that it would ensure me, if necessary, a speedier retreat. But then premonitions are apt to display themselves a little clearer in retrospect. Anyhow, if I had walked up to the house, that night would not have been spent with Mr. Bloom. Mine is a quiet little car. I put her into gear and glided gently in under the spreading chestnut trees towards the entrance, and there came to a standstill. A wide, low porch, supported by 4 slender stone columns, sheltered the beautiful doorway. The metalwork of its fanlight, like that of the gates, was adorned with the device of the pelican feeding her young. Mr. Bloom's crest, no doubt. But in spite of the simplicity of the porch, it was not in keeping, and may have been a later addition to the house. Its echoing stilled. I sat on in the car, idly surveying the scene around me, and almost without conscious thought of it. What state of mind can be more serene, or more active? No notice whatever seemed to have been taken of my intrusion. Silence remained. Indeed, considering the abundant cover around me, there was curiously little bird song, only a faraway thrush calling faintly, "Ahoy, ahoy, ahoy, come to tea, come to tea." After all, it was the merry month of May, and still early, but near at hand. Not even a wren sounded. So presently I got out of the car and mooned off to the end of the shallow stone-faced terrace, stepping deliberately from tuft to tuft of grass and moss. Only a dense shrubbery beyond, yew, ilex, holly, a dampish winding walk. But on this north side of the house there were blinds to the windows, and curtains too, faded but pleasant in color. What few live things may have spied out the intruder had instantly withdrawn. I sighed and turned away. The forsaken pierces quicker to the heart than by way of the mind. My car looked oddly out of place, even a little homesick, under the porch, and was as grey with dust as my pseudo-miller's whiskers. I had come to the conclusion, quite wrongly, that for the time being, the place was unoccupied, though possibly at any moment caretaker or housekeeper might reappear. Indeed, my foot was actually on the step of the car when, as if at a definite summons, I turned my head and discovered not only that the door was now open, but that a figure, Mr. Bloom's, was standing a pace or so beyond the threshold, his regard steadily fixed on myself. Mr. Bloom, a memorable figure. He must have been well over 6 feet in height, but carried his heavy head and shoulders with a pronounced stoop. He was both stout and fat, but his clothes now hung loosely upon him, as if made to old measurements, a wide black morning coat and waistcoat, and brown cloth trousers. I noticed in particular his elegant boots. They were adorned with what I then supposed was an obsolete device, imitation laces. A well-cut pair of boots from a good maker's. His head was bald on the crown, above a fine lofty forehead, but it wore a superfluity of side hair, and his face was bushily bearded. With head drawn back a little, he was surveying me from under very powerful magnifying spectacles, his left hand resting on the inside handle of the door. He had taken me so much by surprise that for the moment I was speechless. We merely looked at one another, he with a more easily justifiable intentness than I. He seemed, as the saying goes, to be sizing me up, to be fitting me in, and it was his voice that at length set the porch echoing again, a voice, as might have been inferred from the look of him, sonorous, but muffled, as if his beard interfered with its resonance. "I see you're interested in the appearance of my house," he was saying. The greeting was courteous enough, and yet extraordinarily impersonal. I made the lamest apologies, adding some trivial comment on the picturesqueness of the scene and the general evening effects. But of this I'm certain, the one thing uppermost in my mind, even at this stage in our brief acquaintance, was the desire not to continue the interview. Mr. Bloom had somehow exhausted my interest in his house. I wanted to shake him off, to go away. He was an empty-looking man, in spite of his domed brow. His house had suggested vacancy. So did he. Not of human inmate, that is, but of pleasing interest. Far from countenancing this inclination, he was inviting me to continue my survey. He was welcoming the interloper. After a slow, comprehensive glance to left and right, he actually stepped out under the porch and, with a peculiar tentative gesture, thrust out a well-kept, fleshy hand in my direction, as if with the intention of putting me entirely at my ease. He then stood solemnly scrutinizing my tiny car. At a loss for any alternative, I withdrew a few paces and took another long look at the facade, the blank windows, their red brick moldings, the peeping chimney stacks, the simple, serene sufficiency of it all. There was a sorry little array, I remember, of abandoned martins' nests plastered up under the narrow jutting of the roof. But this craning attitude was fatiguing, and I returned to the porch. Mr. Bloom had not stirred. He looked like a provincial statue of some forgotten Victorian notability, his feet set close together in those neat, polished indoor boots, his right hand on his watch chain. And now he seemed to be smiling at me out of his bluish-gray, rather prominent eyes, from under those thick, distorting lenses. He was suggesting that I should come in. It was an invitation innocent of warmth, but more pressing than its mere words implied. The wreathing, seductive odor of toasted cheese before the actual trap comes into sight must be similar in effect. There was a suppressed eagerness in the eyes behind those glasses. They had rolled a little in their sockets. And yet, even so, why should I have distrusted him? It would be monstrous to take this world solely on its face value. I was on the point of blurting out a churlish refusal when he stepped back and pushed the door open. The glimpse beyond decided me. For the hall within was peculiarly attractive. Not very lofty, but of admirable proportions, it was panelled in light wood, the carving on its cornice and pilasters tinged here and there with gilt. From its roof hung 3 chandeliers of greenish-gray glass, entrancing things resembling that mysterious exquisite ice that comes only from Waterford. The evening light swam softly in through the uncurtained windows as if upon the stillness of a dream. Empty, it would have been a fascinating room, but just now it was grotesquely packed with old furniture, beautiful, costly things in themselves, but in this hugger-mugger, robbed of charm and grace. Only the narrowest alleyway had been left unoccupied, an alleyway hardly wide enough to enable a human being to come and go without positively mounting up off the floor, as in the land and water game beloved of children. It might have been some antique furniture dealer's interior, prepared for a moonlit flit. Having thus enticed me in under his roof, Mr. Bloom rapidly motioned me on, not even turning his head to see if I were following him. For so cumbersome a man, he was agile, and at the dusky twist to the corridor I found him already awaiting me, his hand on an inner door. "This is the library," he informed me, with a suavity that suggested my being a wealthy visitor to whom he wished to dispose of the property. "One moment," he added hurriedly. "I think I neglected to shut the outer door." A library is often, in effect, little better than a mausoleum. But on a sunny morning, this room must have been as gay as a beautiful young heiress's boudoir. It was evening now. Faded Persian rugs lay on the floor. There was a large writing table. The immense armchairs were covered with red Morocco leather, and the walls, apart from a few engravings and mezzotints, were lined with books. On one side, the books had been removed and laid stacked up in portable bundles beneath the shelves on which they had stood. On the other was a lofty chimney-piece of carved stone, and once again the self-sacrificing pelican showed in the stone, engaged in feeding her brood. I was looking out of the French windows when Mr. Bloom reappeared. He still seemed to be smiling in his non-committal fashion, and treated me to yet another slow scrutiny, the most conspicuous feature of this person, apart from his spectacles, being at such moments the spade guinea that dangled from his watch chain. "Brown trousers, my friend," I was thinking to myself. Why brown? And why not wear clothes that fit? "You are a lover of books," he was murmuring in that flat, muffled voice of his, and we were soon conversing amiably enough on the diversions of literature. He led me steadily from shelf to shelf, but for the time being he was only making conversation. He was detaining me for his own purposes, and successfully staved off every opportunity I attempted to seize of extricating myself from his company. At last I bluntly held out my hand, and in spite of his protestations, so insistent that he began stuttering, I made my way out of the room. Daylight was fading now, and the spectacle of that horde of furniture in the gloaming was oddly depressing. Mr. Bloom had followed me out, cooing as he came on his protestations and regrets that I could spare him no more time. The upper rooms, the garden, my china. I persisted, nevertheless, and myself opened the outer door, and there in the twilight, with as disconsolate an appearance as a cocker spaniel that is wearied of waiting for its mistress, sat my car. I had actually taken my seat in it, having omitted to shake hands with Mr. Bloom, when I noticed that the little Yale gear key was missing. Misadventures like this are absolutely disconcerting. I searched my pockets, leapt out of the car, and searched them again, and not only in vain, but without the faintest recollection in my mind of having removed the key. It was a ridiculous, mortifying situation. With eyes fixed, in an effort to recall my every movement, I gazed out over the wide green turf beneath the motionless chestnut trees, and then at last turned again and looked at Mr. Bloom. With plump hands held loosely and helplessly a little in front of him, and head on one side, he was watching my efforts with an almost paternal concern. "I've mislaid the key," I almost shouted at him, as if the old man were hard of hearing. "Is it anything of importance? Can I get you anything? Water? A little grease?" That one word, grease, was accompanied with so ridiculous a trill that I lost patience. "It's the gear key," I snapped at him. "She's fixed, immovable, useless. I wish to heaven I began aimlessly, fretfully, searching the porch, the turf beyond. Mr. Bloom watched me with the solicitude of a mother. "I ought to have been home an hour ago," I stuttered over my shoulder. "Most vexatious. Dear me, I am distressed. But my memory, too, absent-mindedness. Do you think, by any chance, Mr. Dash, you can have put the key in your pocket?" I stared at him. The suggestion was little short of imbecile, and yet he had evidently had the sagacity to look for my name on my handbag. "What is the nearest town?" I all but shouted. "The nearest," he echoed. "Ah, the nearest. Now, let me see. The nearest town. Garage, of course. A nice question. Come in again. We must get a map. Yes, a map, don't you think? That will be our best course. An excellent plan." I thrust my hand into the leather pocket of the car and produced my own. But only the eyes of an owl could have read its lettering in that light, and somehow it did not occur to me in this tranquil, dusky scene to switch on the lamps. There was no alternative. I followed Mr. Bloom into the house again, and on into his study. He lit a couple of candles. We sat down together at the writing table and examined the map. It was the closest I ever got to him. The position was ludicrous. Montresor was a good 4 miles from the nearest village of any size, 7 from the nearest railway station, and that on a branch line. And here was this old man peppering me with futile advice and offers of assistance, and yet obviously beaming with satisfaction at my dilemma. There was not even a servant in the house to take a telegram to the village, if a telegram had been of the slightest use. I hastily folded up my map, folded it wrong, of course, and sat glooming. He was breathing a little rapidly after this exercise of intelligence. "But why be disturbed?" he entreated me. "Why? A misadventure, but of no importance. Indeed not. You will give me the pleasure of being my guest for the night. Nothing but a happiness, I assure you. Say no more. It won't incommode me in the slightest degree. This old house, a most unfortunate accident. They should make larger, heavier keys. Ridiculous. But then, I am no mechanic." He stooped round at me, the loose, copious creature. It was almost coy. "Frankly, my dear young sir, I cannot regret an accident that promises me more of your company. We bookish people, you understand." I protested, stood up, and once more began searching my pockets. His head jerked back into its habitual posture. "Ah, I see what is in your mind. Think nothing of it. Yes. Comforts, conveniences curtailed, I agree. But my good housekeeper always prepares a meal sufficient for two. Mere habit, Mr. Dash, almost animal habit. And besides, why not? I will forage for myself. A meal miscellaneous, perhaps, but not unsatisfying. He beamed. Why not take a look at the garden, meanwhile, before it's dark? The tones had fallen still flatter. The face had become immobile. I was cornered. It was useless to protest. It would have been atrociously uncivil. He himself thrust open the windows for me. Fuming within, I stumped out onto the terrace while he went off to forage. I saw in fancy those thick spectacles eyeing the broken meats in the great larder. What was wrong with the man? What made him so extortionately substantial and yet in effect so elusive and unreal? What indeed constitutes the reality of a fellow creature in himself? The something, the someone within, surely not the mere physical frame. In Mr. Bloom's company, that physical frames seemed to be mainly a kind of stalking horse. If so, the fowler was exquisitely intent on not alarming his prey. Those honeyed decoy notes. But then what conceivably could he want of me? Whom had he been waiting for, skulking there at some convenient window? Why was he alone in this great house? Only Mr. Bloom could answer these questions, and owing to some odd scruple of manners or what-not, I couldn't put them to him. Absurd. My mind, by this time, wearied of these vexations, had begun to follow my eyes. I was looking northward, a clear luster as of glass now in the heavens. It had been a calm but almost colourless sunset, and westward the evening star floated like a morsel of silver in a dove-grey fleece of cloud drawn gently across the blue of the horizon. The countryside lay darkly purple and Saturnine, and about 100 yards away in this direction was a wide stretch of water, dead white under the sky. A lake. Wildfowl. Yet not so much as a peewit crying. In front of me the garden was densely walled in with trees, and an exceedingly skilful topiarist had been at work on the nearest yews. Year after year he must have been clipping his birds and arches and vast mushrooms and even an obelisk. They were now in their freshest green. Mr. Bloom's servants cannot have forsaken him in a batch. They weren't gone, though. Not a light showed in the dusk. No movement, no sound except out of the far distant, presently the faint, dreamlike churring of a nightjar. It is the bird of wooded solitude. Well, there would be something of a moon that night, I knew. She would charm out the owls, and should at least ensure me a lullaby. But why this distaste, this sense of inward disquietude? And suddenly I wheeled about at the sound, as I thought, of a footstep. But no, I was alone. Mr. Bloom must still be busy foraging in his back quarters or his cellarage. And yet, is it credible? Once more, in a last forlorn hope, I began to search my pockets for the missing key. But this time Mr. Bloom interrupted the operation. He came out sleeking his hands together in front of him and looking as amiably hospitable as a churchwarden at a parochial conversation. He led me in, volubly explaining the while that, since he had been alone in the house, he had all but given up the proper use of the upper rooms. As a matter of fact, I am preparing to leave, he told me, as soon as it is convenient. Meanwhile, I camp on the ground floor. There is many a novelty in the ordinary routine of life, Mr. Dash, that we seldom enjoy. It amused my secretary, this system of picnicking, poor fellow, for a while. He came to a standstill on the threshold of the room into which he was leading me. A cluster of candles burned on the long oak table, set out for our evening meal. But otherwise the room, not very much smaller than the study, and containing almost as many books, was thickly curtained, and in darkness. I must explain, he was saying, and he laid the 4 fingers of his left hand very gently on my shoulder, that my secretary has left me. He has left me for good. He is dead. With owl-like solemnity, he scrutinized the blank face I turned on him, as if he were expectant of sympathy. But I had none to give. You can't even feign sympathy without preparation. Mr. Bloom glanced over his shoulder into the corridor behind us. He's been a great loss, he added. I miss him. On the other hand, he added more cheerfully, we mustn't allow our personal feelings to interfere with the enjoyment of what I'm afraid even at best is an extremely modest little meal. Again, Mr. Bloom was showing himself incapable of facing facts. It was by no means a modest little meal. Our cold bouillon was followed by a pair of spring chickens, the white sauce on their delicate breasts adorned in the most elegant design with fragments of cucumber, radish, truffle, and mushroom. There was an asparagus salad, so cold to the tongue as to suggest ice, and neighboring it were a dish of meringues and an amber-colored wine jelly, richly clotted with cream. Champagne was our wine, and it was solely owing to my abstemiousness that we failed to finish the second bottle. Between his mouthfuls, Mr. Bloom indulged in general conversation, of the exclamatory order. It covered a pretty wide autobiographical field. He told me of his boyhood in Montresor. The estate had been in his family for close on 2 centuries. These last few years, he had shared it with an only sister. She's there, he exclaimed, pointing an instant with uplifted fork at a portrait that hung to the right of the chimney-piece. I glanced up at Miss Bloom. She was looking in the other direction, and our real and painted eyes did not meet. It seemed incredible that these two could ever have been children, have played together, giggled, quarreled, and made it up. Even if I could imagine the extinguished lady in the portrait as a little girl, no feat of fancy could convert Mr. Bloom into a small boy. A sufferable one, I mean. By the time I'd given up the attempt, and having abandoned the jelly, we had set to work on the camembert cheese. Mr. Bloom's remarks about his secretary had become almost aggrieved. He was of indispensable use to me in my literary work. Modest enough in itself. I won't trouble you with that. Only an obscure byway of interest. Indispensable. We differed in our views, of course. No human beings ever see perfectly eye to eye on such a topic. In a word, the occult. But he had an unusual flair. He laid his left hand on the table. I am not denying that for one moment. We succeeded in attaining the most curious and interesting results from our little experiments. I could astonish you. I tried in vain to welcome the suggestion, but the light, even of 4 candles, is a little stupefying when one has to gaze through them at one's host. And Mr. Bloom was sitting immediately opposite to me on the other side of the table. My own personal view, he explained, is that his ill health was in no way due to these investigations. Indeed, it was against my wish that he should continue them on his own account. Flatly, 2 heads, 2 wills, 2 cautions even, I might say, are better than 1 in such matters. Dr. Ponsonby. I should explain that Dr. Ponsonby is my medical advisor. He attended my poor sister in her last illness. Dr. Ponsonby, unfortunately, lives at some great distance, but he did not hesitate to sacrifice all the time he could spare. On the other hand, as far as I can gather, he was not in the least surprised that when the end came, it came suddenly. My secretary, Mr. Dash, was found dead in his bed, that is, in his bedroom. Speaking for myself, I should... Back went his head again, and once more his slightly bolting eyes gazed out at me like polished agates across the silvery luster of the candlelight. Speaking for myself, his voice muffled itself almost to the inarticulate beneath his beard. I should prefer to go quickly when I have to go at all. The white, plump hand replenished his glass with champagne. Not that I intend to imply that I have any immediate desire for that. You, yourself, he added, almost merrily, having enjoyed only 1/3 of my experience in this world, must desire that consummation even less. You mean to die, Mr. Bloom? I put it to him. His chin lowered itself into his collar again. The eyelids descended over his eyes. Precisely. Though it is as well to remember, there is more than one way of dying. There is first the body to be taken into account, and there's next what remains. Though nowadays, of course, well, I'll leave it to you. Mr. Bloom was a peculiar conversationalist. Like an astute letter writer, he ignored questions in which he was not interested or did not wish to answer, and with the agility of a chimpanzee in his native wilds would swing off from a topic not to his liking to another that up to that point had not even been hinted at. Quite early in our tete-a-tete meal, I began to suspect that the secret of his welcome to a visitor who had involuntarily descended on him out of the blue was a desire to indulge in talk. Events proved this to be true only in part, but in the meantime it became pretty evident why Mr. Bloom should be in want of company. I mean of ordinary human company. He seemed to have wearied of his secretary some little time before that secretary had been summoned away. You will agree, my dear sir, that to see eye to eye with an invalid for any protracted period is a severe strain. Illness breeds fancies, not all of them considerate. Not a happy youth, ever. Introspective, an introvert in the cant of our time, but still meaning well, and oh yes, endeavoring not to give way when in company. My sister never really liked him, but then she was the prey of conventions that are, yet for some, maybe, a safeguard. We shared the same interests, of course, he and I. Our arrangement was based on that. He had his own views, but at times, oh yes. He filled his glass again, exceedingly obstinate about them. He had little staying power. He began to fumble, to hesitate, to question, to fluster himself, and me too, for that matter, just when we were arriving at an excessively interesting juncture. You know the general process, of course. He had glanced up over his food at me, but not in order to listen to my answer. Any answer I might have given. It is this. And he forthwith embarked on a long and tedious discourse concerning the sweet uses of the planchette, of automatic writing, table rapping, the hidden slate ectoplasm, and all the other, to me rather disagreeable, paraphernalia of the spiritualistic seance. Nothing I could say or do, not even unconcealed and deliberate yawning, had the least effect upon Mr. Bloom's fluency. Lung trouble appeared to have been the primary cause of his secretary's final resignation. But if the unfortunate young man had night after night been submitted to the experience that I was now enduring, exasperation and boredom alone would have accounted for it. How on earth, indeed, I asked myself, could he have endured Mr. Bloom so long? I ceased to listen. The cascade of talk suddenly came to an end. Mr. Bloom laid his hands on either side of his plate and once more fixed me in silence under his glasses. You yourself have possibly dabbled a little in my hobby, he inquired. And indeed, in my young days, my family had possessed an elderly female friend, a Miss Altagood. She had been one of my mother's bridesmaids, and it was an unwritten law in the household that every possible consideration and affection should be shown to her in all circumstances. The poor soul, she had come down in the world, lived up on the top floor in lodgings in Westbourne Park. She was tall, gaunt, dark, and affectionate, and she had a consuming interest in the other world. I hear her now. On the other side, my dear Charles. Another plane, Charles. When I myself pass over. For old sake's sake, and I am afraid for very little else, I used to go to tea with her occasionally, and we would sit together, the heat welling up out of the sun-struck street outside her window, and she would bring out the hateful little round Victorian table and the wine glass and the cardboard alphabet, and we'd ask questions of the unseen, the mischievous, the half-crazy, the unknowable, and she would grow flushed and excited and full of trepidations and misgivings and triumphs. And though I can honestly say I never deliberately tampered with that execrable little wine-glass in its wanderings over the varnished table, and though she herself never deliberately cooked the messages it spelt out for us, we enjoyed astonishing revelations. Those spiritualistic answers to our cross-examination were at the same time so unintelligibly intelligent, and so unutterably silly and futile that my mind had been cured once and for all of the faintest interest in the other side. If anything, in fact, the experience had even a little tarnished the side Mr. Bloom now shared with me. For this reason alone, his first mention of the subject had almost completely taken away my appetite for his cold chicken, his asparagus, his jelly, his champagne. After all, that other side's borderline, from which, according to the poet, no traveller returns, must be a good many miles longer even than the wall of China, and not all its gates can lead to plains of peace or paradise or even human endurableness. I explained at last to Mr. Bloom that my interest in spiritualism was of the tepidest variety. Those prominent stone-blue eyes of his, faintly illuminated by the concentrated candlelight, incited me to be more emphatic than I intended. I told him I detested the whole subject. It is my conviction, I assured him, that if the messages, results, whatever you like to call them, are anything else than the babblings of subconsciousness, a deadly dubious term in itself, then they are probably the work of something or somebody even more sub than that. I knew very little at first hand about the subject, but ignorance, of course, gives one strength. Whatever I have heard, I told him, from that source, of the future that awaits us when we get out of this body of ours, Mr. Bloom, fills me with nothing but regret that this life is not the end of everything. I don't say that you get nowhere, and I don't say that you mayn't get further someday than you intend. But, I stupidly blustered on, my own personal opinion is that the whole business, so conducted, is a silly and dangerous waste of time. His eyes never wavered. He lowered his head by not the fraction of an inch. All that you are saying, my dear Mr. Dash, he replied, amuses me. Extraordinary, most amusing, illuminating. Quite so, quite so. Capital. You tell me that you know nothing about the subject. Oh, yes. And that it is silly and dangerous. Ah, yes. And why not? Dangerous. Well, one word in your ear. Here, my dear sir, we are in the very thick of it. A positive hotbed. But if there is one course I should avoid... His eyes withdrew themselves, and the thick glasses blazed into the candlelight once more. It would be that of taking any personal steps to initiate you into our mysteries. No, I shall leave matters completely to themselves. His intonation had been equable, his expression had never wavered. Only his thick fingers trembled a little on the tablecloth, but he was grey with rage. It seemed even that the scalp of his head had a little raised the hair on its either side, so intense was his resentment. A happy state, ignorance, Mr. Dash. That of our first parents. And then, like a fool, I flared up and mentioned Miss Altagood. He listened, steadily smiling. I see, a professional medium, he insinuated at last, with a shrug of his great heavy shoulders. Pooh, banal. I hotly defended my well-meaning, sentimental old friend. Indeed, a retired governess. And once more, his rage nearly mastered him. Have no fear, Mr. Dash. She is not on my visiting list. There are deeps, and vasty deeps. With that, he thrust out a hand and caught up the chicken bone that had long lain discarded on my plate. Come out there, he called baldly. Here, you. His head dipped out of sight as he stooped, and a yellowish dog, with a white gleaming sidelong eye, of which up to the present I had seen or heard no symptom, came skulking out from under a chair in the corner of the room to enjoy its evening meal. For a while only the crunching of teeth on bones broke the silence. You greedy, you glutton, Mr. Bloom was cajoling him. Aye, but where's Steve? An animal's intelligence, Mr. Dash. His voice floated up to me from under the other side of the table, is concentrated in his belly. And even when one climbs up to human prejudices, one usually finds the foundation as material. For an instant I could make no reply to this pleasantry. He took advantage of the pause to present me with a smile. There. I refuse to disagree, he was saying. Your company has been very welcome to me, and, well, One should never embark on one's little private preserves without encouragement. My own, in particular, meet with very scant courtesy, usually. That animal could tell a tale. The crunching continued. Couldn't you, you rascal? Where's Steve? Where's Steve? Now, get along back. The scrunching ceased. The yellowish dog retreated into its corner. And now, Mr. Dash, declared Mr. Bloom, if you have sufficiently refreshed yourself, let us leave these remains. These last few years I have detested being encumbered with servants in the house. Foreign element. They are further away from us, I assure you, in all that really matters, than that rascal Chunks there is in the corner. Eh, you old devil? He called at his pet. Ain't it so? Now, let me see. He took out a worn gold watch. 9 o'clock. Just 9. We have a long evening before us. Believe me, I am exceedingly grateful for your company and regret that... but there, I see you have already forgiven an old man's edginess. There was something curiously aimless, even pathetic, in the tones of that last remark. He had eaten with excellent appetite and had accounted for at least 4/5 of our champagne, but he rose from the table looking more dejected than I should have supposed possible, and shuffled away in his slippers as if the last 10 minutes had added years to his age. He was leading the way with the candelabrum in his hand, but to avoid their guttering, I suppose, had blown out 3 of its candles. A dusky moonlight loomed beyond the long French windows of his study. The faint earthy scent of spring and night saturated the air, for one of them was open. He paused at sight of it, glancing about him. If there is an animal I cannot endure, he muttered over his shoulder at me, it is the cat. The feline cat. They have a history. They retreat into the past when we meet them in far other circumstances. Yes, yes. He had closed and bolted the window, drawn shutters and curtains while he was speaking. And now, bless my soul, Mr. Dash, how about your room? With feet close together, he stood looking at me. My secretary's now. Would that meet the case? He was a creature of comfort. But one has fancies, reluctances, perhaps. As I say, the upper rooms are all dismantled, though we might put up a camp bed up there, and water in the bathroom. I myself sleep in here. He stepped across and drew aside a curtain hung between the bookcases, but there was not light enough to see beyond it. The room I propose is also on this floor, so we should not, if need be far apart. Now come this way. He paused. Once more he led me out and stopped at the third door of the corridor on the left-hand side. So long was the pause, one might have supposed he was waiting for permission to enter. I followed him in. It was a lofty room, a bed-sitting room, its curtains and upholstery of a pale purple. Its window was shut, the air stuffy and faintly sweet. The bed was in the further corner to the left of the window, and there again the dusky moonlight showed. I sat looking at the mute, inanimate things around me in that blending of the 2 faint lights. No doubt if I had been ignorant that the owner or user of the room had made his last exit there, I should have noticed little unusual in its stillness, its vacant calm. And yet, well, I had left a friend only that afternoon, still a little breathless after his scramble up the nearer bank of Jordan. And now this was the last place on earth, these 4 walls, these colors, this bookcase, that table, that window, which Mr. Bloom's secretary had set eyes on before setting out, not to return. My host watched me. He would, I think, have pulled the curtains over these windows, too, if I'd given him an opportunity. You think I hesitate to press the matter, but in fact, Mr. Dash, it is the only room I can offer you. I thanked him, assuring him that I should be comfortable. Capital, cried Mr. Bloom. Excellent. My only apprehension, well, you know how sensitive people may be. You will find me in the study, and I can assure you that one little theme shall not intrude on us again. The bee may buzz, but I will keep my bonnet on. The 4th door on the right, after turning to your right down the corridor. I'm leaving you no light. He lit the candles on his secretary's dressing table and withdrew. I myself stood for a while, gazing stupidly out of the window. Apart from his extraordinary fluency, Mr. Bloom, I realized, was an exceedingly secretive old man. I'd known all along that it was not my beautiful eyes he was after, or even my mere company. The old creature, admirable mask though his outward appearance might be, was on edge. He was detesting his solitude, though until recently, at any rate, it had been the one aim of his life. It had even occurred to me that he was not much missing his secretary. Quite the reverse, he had spoken of him with contempt. There were two things unforgiven in Mr. Bloom's mind indeed, some acute disagreement between them, and the fact that Mr. Champneys had left him without due notice, unless inefficient lungs constitute due notice. I took one of the candles and glanced at the books. They were chiefly of fiction and a little poetry. There was a complete row of manuscript books with pigskin backs labeled Proceedings. I turned to the writing table. Little there of interest: a stopped clock, a dried-up inkwell, a tarnished silver cup, and one or two books: The Sentimental Journey, a Thomas à Kempis, bound in limp maroon leather. I opened the Thomas à Kempis and read the spidery inscription on the flyleaf. To darling Sidney, with love from Mother. It startled me, as if I'd been caught in a theft. Life surely should never come to that. Some secret voice within piped out of the void. I shut the book up. The drawer beneath contained only envelopes and letter paper. Montresor, in large, pale blue letters on a Silurian background, and thick black exercise book, with a label Diary, S.S. Champneys. I glanced up, then turned to the last entry, dated only 6 weeks ago, just a few scribbled words. Not me, at any rate, not me. And even if I could get away, for the ink was smudged, and had left its ghost on the blank page opposite it. A mere scrap of feminine handwriting in that poor hasty smudge of ink. It resembled an incantation. Mr. Bloom's secretary himself seemed to be sharing his secrets with me. I shut up that book, too, and turned away. To my astonishment, a log fire was handsomely burning in the grate when I returned to the study, and Mr. Bloom, having drawn up two of his voluminous armchairs in front of it, was now deeply and amply encased in one of them. He had taken off his spectacles and appeared to be asleep, but his eyes opened at my footstep. He had been merely resting, perhaps. "I hope," was his greeting, "you found everything needful, Mr. Dash, in the circumstances." He called this up at me as if I were at a distance, but his tone subsided again. "But there's just one little matter we missed, eh? Night attire. Not that you wouldn't find a complete trousseau to choose from in the wardrobe. My secretary, in fact, was inclined to be foppish. No blame, no blame. Fine feathers, Mr. Dash." It is, thank heaven, an unusual experience to be compelled to share an evening as the guest of a stranger one distrusts. It was not only that Mr. Bloom's manner was obviously a mask, but even the occasional stupidity of his remarks seemed to be an affectation, and one of a rare and dangerous kind. As for Montresor, it was the simplest and happiest of things. It shared its quiet 18th-century charm with its every door-plate and moulding. One fell in love with it at first sight, as with an open, charming face. But then, a look in the eyes. It reeked of the dubious and distasteful. But how can one produce definite evidence for such sensations as these? They lie outside the tests even of mighty science, as must a good many other things that don't conform with the norm of human evidence. Mr. Bloom's company at a dinner party or a reception might have proved refreshingly droll. He did his best to make himself amusing. He had read widely, and out-of-the-way books, too, and had an unusual range of interests. We discussed music and art, and he brought out portfolio after portfolio of drawings and etchings to illustrate some absurd theory he had of the one, and play a scrap or two of Debussy and Ravel to prove some far-fetched little theory of his own about the other. We talked of chance and dreams and disease and heredity, edged on to woman, and skated rapidly away. He dismissed life as an episode in disconcerting surroundings, and scuttled off from a eulogy of Fabre to the problem of pain. "Mr. Dash, we fear pain too much, and the giving of it. The very mention of the word stifles me, and how unchristian. The look he peeked down at me at this was proof enough that he was intent only on decoying me on and drawing me out, but I was becoming a little more cautious, and suggested that that kind of philosophy best begins at home. Aye, indeed, a retort, with Charity on the other side of the hearth, in a mob cap and carpet slippers, I suppose. I see the dear creatures, I see them. Still you will agree, even you will agree, that once, Mr. Dash, the head loses its way in the heart, one's brain-pan might as well be a basin of soap bubbles. A man of feeling, by all means, but just a trace, a soupçon of rationality, while it serves, eh? A few minutes afterwards, in the midst of a discourse on the progress of thought, he suddenly inquired if I cared for the game of backgammon. And why not? Or draughts, Mr. Dash, a grossly underestimated amusement. But all this fluency, these high spirits, were clearly an elaborate disguise. He was keeping it up, merely to keep me up, and maybe to keep himself up. Much of it was automatic, mere mental antics. Like a Tibetan praying wheel, his mind went round, and his attention was divided. One at least of those long, narrow ears was cocked in another direction. And at last the question that had been on my tongue throughout most of the evening popped out almost automatically. I asked if he were expecting a visitor. At the moment his round black back was turned. He was rummaging in a corner cupboard for glasses to accompany the decanter of whiskey he had produced, his head turned slyly on his heavy shoulders. A visitor? You astonish me. Here? Now? As if, my dear Mr. Dash, this rural retreat were Bloomsbury or Mayfair. You amuse me. Callers? Thank heaven, not so. Be candid with me. Let us go back an hour or two. You came, you saw, but you did not expect a welcome. The unworthy tenant of Montresor took you by surprise. Confess it. So be it. And why not? What if you yourself were my looked-for visitor? What then? There are surmises, intuitions, forebodings, to give a pleasant tinge to the word. Yes, I agree. I was on the watch, patiently. In due time, your charming little car appears at my gate. You pause. I say to myself, here he is. Company at last. Discussion. Pow-wow. Even controversy, perhaps. Why not? We are sharing the same hemisphere, plain as a pikestaff. I foresaw your decision, as may the shepherd in contemplation of a red sunrise foresee the deluge. I stepped downstairs, and here we are. My reply came a little more warmly than I intended. I assured Mr. Bloom that if it had not been for the loss of my key, I shouldn't have stayed 5 minutes. I prefer not to be expected in a strange house. It was unutterably gauche. He chuckled. He shrugged his shoulders. He was vastly amused. But are we not forgetting that such little misadventures are merely part and parcel of the general plan? The end-shaping process, as the poet puts it. What general plan? Mr. Dash, when you fire out your inquiries at me like bullets out of the muzzle of a gun, I am positively disconcerted. I can scarcely keep my wits together. Pray let us not treat each other like witnesses in the witness box, or even, a cat-like smiles crept into his face, like prisoners in the dock. Have a little whiskey, pure malt. Taut? It may be whimsical, but for me one of the few exasperating things about my poor secretary, Mr. Champneys, was his aversion to alcohol. 300 pounds a year, Mr. Dash, no less, and everything found. No expenses except fiction, pajamas, tooth powder, and petrol. A motor bicycle, in fact. Now, war to combat. And alcohol, if you please. What a word. What a libel. These specialists, soda water or Apollinaris. In sheer chagrin, I drank the stuff and rose to turn in. Not a bit of it. With covert glances at his watch, Mr. Bloom kept me there by hook and by crook until it was long past midnight, and try as he might to conceal it, the disquietude that had peeped out earlier in the evening became more and more apparent. The only effect of this restlessness on his talk, however, was to increase its volume and incoherence. If Mr. Bloom had been play-acting and had been cast for his own character, His improvisation could not have been more masterly. He hardly made any pretense now of listening to my small part in this display, and when he did, it was only in order to attend to some other business he had in mind. Ever and again, as if to emphasize his point, he would haul himself up out of his deep-bottomed chair and edge off towards the door, with a pretense, maybe, of looking for a book. He would pause there for but an instant, and the bumbling, muffled voice would once again take up his strain. Once, however, he came to a dead stop, raised his hand, and openly stood listening. "A nightingale, certainly, if not two," he muttered, sotto voce. "But tell me, Mr. Dash," he called softly out across the room, "was I deceived into thinking I heard a distant knocking? In a house large as this, articles of some value, perhaps. We read even of violence. You can never tell." I asked him with clumsy irony if there would be anything remarkable in that. "Don't your friends ever volunteer even a rap or two on their own account? I should have supposed it would be the least they could offer." "A signal, a rap or two," he echoed me blandly. "How that?" "From the other side." Yeah? He suddenly broke off, his cheek whitening, the sole cause of his dismay being merely a scratching at the door panel, announcing that his faithful pet had so much wearied of solitude in the dining-room that he had come seeking even his master's company. But Mr. Bloom did not open the door. "Be off," he called at the panel. "Away, sir, to your mat. That dog, Mr. Dash, is more than human, or shall we say, less than human." The words were jovial enough, but the lips that uttered them trembled beneath his beard. I'd had enough, and this time got my way. He accompanied me to the door of the study, but not further, and held out his hand. "If by any chance," he scarcely more than murmured, "you should want anything in the night, you will know, of course, where to find me. I'm in there." He pointed. "On the other hand, Mr. Dash." He laid his hand again on my arm, deprecatingly, almost as if with shy affection. "I am an exceedingly poor sleeper, and occasionally I find a brief amble round proves a sedative. Follow me up, by all means. I should welcome it. But tonight, I expect nothing." He closed the door again. "Have you ever tried that particular remedy for insomnia? Mere cold air?" Oh, wait, I think I'm on the wrong... Oh, yeah, I should have been reading that in the other character's voice. Sorry. He closed the door again. "Have you ever tried that particular remedy for insomnia? Mere cold air? Or perhaps a hard biscuit, just to humor the circulation? But a young man? No. The machine comparatively new. My housekeeper returns at 6. Breakfast, I hope, at 8:30. A most punctual woman. A treasure. But then, servants. I detest the whole race of them. Good night. Good night. And none of those proceedings, I warn you." But even now I had not completely shaken him off. He hastened after me, puffing as he came, and clutched at my coat sleeve. "What I was meaning, Mr. Dash, is that I have never attempted to make converts. A fruit, let me tell you, that from being incredibly raw and unwholesome rapidly goes rotten. Besides, my secretary had very little talent for marshalling facts. That's why I mentioned the proceedings. A turn for writing, maybe, but no method. Just that, and now, of course, you must go. Our evening is at an end, but who knows? Of course, never matter. What must come, comes." At last I was free, though his whisper presently pursued me down the corridor. "No need for caution, Mr. Dash. Should you need me, no infants, no invalids. Sleep well." Having put my candlestick on the table, shut the door of Mr. Champney's bedroom, and very softly locked it, I sat down on the bed to think things over. Easier said than done. The one thing in my mind was relief at finding myself alone again, and of distaste as I wound my watch at the recollection of how many hours still remained before dawn. I opened the window and looked out. The porch was out of sight. Mr. Bloom's nightingales, if not creatures of his imagination, had ceased to lament. A ground mist lay like a lake of milk beneath the chestnut trees, soundlessly lapping their boughs. I drew in. The draught had set my candle guttering. Almost automatically I opened one of the long drawers in Mr. Champney's chest. It was crammed with his linen. Had he no relatives then, I wondered, or had Mr. Bloom succeeded to his property? These pajamas would grace an Arabian prince, of palest blue silk with SSC in beautiful scarlet lettering. He was fastidious, perhaps, but I left them undisturbed. There were a few photographs above the chimney-piece, but photographs of the relatives and friends of a deceased stranger are not exhilarating company. Mr. Champneys himself being dead, these two seemed to be tinged with the same eclipse. One of them was a snapshot of a tall, dark young man in tennis clothes. He was smiling. He had a longish nose. A racket was under his arm, and a tiny strip of maroon and yellow ribbon had been glued to the frame. Another Champneys, a brother, perhaps. I stood there, idly gazing at it for minutes together, as if in search of inspiration. No talker had ever more completely exhausted me than Mr. Bloom. Even while I was still deep in contemplation of the photograph, I was seized suddenly with a series of yawns almost painful in their intensity. I turned away. My one longing was for the bathroom. But no, Mr. Bloom had failed to show me the way there, and any attempt to find it for myself might involve me in more talk. It is embarrassing to meet anyone after farewells have been said, but that one, no. Half-dressed and having hunted in vain for a second box of matches, I lay down on the bed, drew its purple quilt over me. After all, Mr. Bloom's secretary had not died in it, and blew out my candle. I must have at once fallen asleep, a heavy and maybe dreamless sleep, but woke softly, instantly, as if at an inward signal. Night had gone, the creeping grey of dawn was at the window. Its coldish, mist-burdened airs filled the room. I lay a while inert, sharply scrutinizing my surroundings, realizing precisely where I was, and at the same time that something was radically and inexplicably wrong with them. What? It is difficult to suggest, but it was as if a certain aspect of the room, its walls, angles, furniture, had been peculiarly intensified. Whatever was naturally grotesque in it was now more grotesque, and less real. Matter seldom advertises the precariousness imputed to it by the physicist, but now every object around me seemed to be proclaiming its own transitoriness. With a conviction that thrilled me like an unexpected contact with ice, I suddenly realized that this is how Mr. Champney's room would appear to anyone who had become, for some reason or another, intensely afraid. It may sound wildly preposterous, but I stick to it. I myself was not afraid. There was as yet nothing to be afraid of, and yet everything I saw seemed to be dependent on that most untrustworthy but vivid condition of consciousness. Once I let my mind, so to speak, accept the evidence of my senses, then I should be as helpless as the victim of a drug or of the wildest nightmare. I sat there, stiff and cold, eyeing the door. And then I heard the sound of voices, the faint, hollow, incoherent sound that voices make at a distance in a large house. At that, I confess, a deadly chill came over me. As gingerly as a cat, I stepped down to the floor, put on the rest of my clothes, and over them a floral dressing gown that hung on the door-hook. Thus attired, I was disguised, but ready for action. It took me half a minute to unlock the door. Caution is snail slow. I was shivering a little, but that may have been due to the cold May morning. The voices were more distinct now. One of them, I fancied, was Mr. Bloom's, but there was a curious similarity between them, so much so that I may have been playing eavesdropper to Mr. Bloom talking to himself. The sound was filtering down from an upper room, my corridor beneath being as still as a drop scene in a theater, the footlights out. I listened, but could detect no words, and then the talking ceased. There came a sort of thump at the other end of the house, and then overhead the sound as of someone retreating towards it, heavily, unaccustomedly, but at a pretty good pace. Inaction is unnerving, and yet I hesitated, detesting the thought of meeting Mr. Bloom again, and especially if he had company. But that little risk had to be taken. There was no help for it. I tiptoed along the corridor and entered his study. The curtain at the further end of the room was drawn aside. A deep-piled Turkey carpet adorned the floor of his study. I crossed it and looked in. The light here was duskier than in my own room, and at first, after one comprehensive glance, I saw nothing unusual, except that near at hand was a sofa, half covered by a traveling rug, and standing beside it, a familiar pair of boots. Unmistakable, ludicrous, excellent boots. Empty as only boots can be. They squatted there side by side like creatures, but by no means mute, yet speechless. And towards the head of the sofa, on a little round table drawn up beside it, lay the miscellaneous contents, obviously, of Mr. Bloom's pockets. The old gold watch and the spade guinea, a note case, a pocket book, the pencil case, a scrap of carved stained ivory, an antique silver toothpick, a couple of telegram envelopes, a bunch of keys, a heap of loose money. I see them all, but I see even more distinctly, and it was actually hobnobbing with the spade guinea, a solitary Yale key. Why Mr. Bloom emptied his pockets at night, I cannot guess. A habit possibly from childhood. His black morning coat had been thrown over a chair. No other clothes were visible. But I made no search. The crux was that key. There is, I suppose, no limit to human stupidity. Never once had it occurred to me that Mr. Bloom himself had been responsible for its loss. I stole nearer and examined it. Yale keys at a casual glance are as like one another as leaves on a tree. Was this mine? I was uncertain. I must risk it. The footsteps seemed now to be dully thumping down a remote flight of wooden stairs, and it was unmistakably Mr. Bloom's voice that I heard booming back at me, but with all its manlier resonances and its gusto gone. Yes, yes, coming, coming. And the footsteps stumped on. Well, I had no wish to interfere with any assignation. I had long since suspected that Mr. Bloom's activities might have proved responsible for guests even more undesirable than myself. Like attracts like, I assume, in any sphere. I blame, moreover, if my raw prejudices were unfair to his chosen methods of spiritistic investigation. He seemed to have pressed on a little further than most. That is all. A pioneer. What I was not prepared for was the spectacle of Mr. Bloom's bed. When I entered the room, I am perfectly certain that there had been nothing abnormal about that, except that it had not been slept in. True, the light had meanwhile increased a little, but not much. No, the bed then had been empty. Not so now. The lower part of it was all but entirely flat. The white coverlid over it was drawn almost as neat and close from side to side of it as the cover of a billiard table, but on the pillow, the beard protruding over the turned-down sheet, now showed what appeared to be the head and face of Mr. Bloom. With head jerked back, I watched that face steadily, transfixedly. It was a flawless facsimile, waxen, motionless. But it was not a real face and head. It was a hallucination. How induced is quite another matter. No spirit of life, no livingness had ever stirred those soap-like, stagnant features. It was a travesty, utterly devoid, whatever its intention, of the faintest hint of humor. It was merely a mask, a lifelike mask, past even the dexterity of a Chinese artist to rival, and, though I hardly know why, it was inconceivably shocking. Even when I made them, my remarks about indiscriminate spiritualism the evening before had been inadequate. At this moment they seemed to be grotesquely inadequate. This house was not haunted, it was infested. Cat's paw, poor young Mr. Champneys must have been. But he had indeed helped with the chestnuts. A horrible weariness and nausea swept over me. Without another glance at the bed, I made my way as rapidly as possible to the outer door. I broke into a run. Still thickly muffled with her last journey's dust, except for the fingerprints I afterwards noticed on her bonnet, my car faithfully awaited me in the innocent blue of dawn beneath the porch. My heart literally stood still as I inserted the key, but thank heaven I had not been mistaken. The first burring of the engine was accompanied by the sound of a window being flung violently open. It was above and behind me, beyond the porch. I turned my head and detected a vague grayish figure, standing a little within cover of the hollies and ilexes. A short man, about 20 or 30 yards away, not looking at me. But he, too, may have been pure illusion, hallucination. When I looked again, he was gone. There was no sunshine yet. The garden was as still as a mechanical panorama. But the hubbub, the babbling, was increasing overhead. In an instant I had shot out from under the porch, and, dignity forgotten, was on my way helter-skelter round the semicircular drive. But to my utter confusion, the gates at this end of it were heavily padlocked. I all but stripped the gears in my haste to retreat, but succeeded none the less, and then, without so much as turning my head towards the house, I drove clean across the lawn, the boughs of the blossom-burdened trees actually brushing the hood of the car as I did so. In 5 minutes I must have been nearly 4 miles from Mr. Bloom's precincts. It was fortunate, perhaps, the day was so early. Even the most phlegmatic of rural constables might look a little askance at a motorist in a purple dressing-gown and red morocco slippers. But I was innocent of robbery, for in exchange for these articles I had left behind me as valuable a jacket and a pair of brown leather shoes. I wonder what they will fetch at the sale. I wonder if Mr. Bloom would have offered me Mr. Champney's full £300 per annum if I had consented to stay. He was sorely in need, I think, of human company. A less easily prejudiced stranger than I might have been of crucial help to him in his extreme circumstances. But I ran away, and it is now too late to make amends. He has gone home, as we all shall, and taken his wages. But what really troubles me, now and then with acute misgivings, is the thought of Miss Altagood. She was so simple and so silly a Thomasina Tiddler. She dabbled in those obscure waters as heedlessly and as absorbedly as some little dark, intense creature on the banks of the Serpentine over a gallipot of tiddlers. I hate to think of any of them taking her seriously, of the possibility some day, too, when she is groping her way through that other world, for she never really found it in this, the possibility of her meeting Mr. Bloom. I would like to warn her against that, if I could. Those dark, affectionate, saddened, hungry eyes. And yet I know of no harm he did.